morning and welcome to today's almost daily devotional. Let us turn back to Paul. We're going to finish Acts this week, so 27 and 28, and then next week we're going to move on to talking about hope and what does hope look like for a Christian. We're going to read just a little selection of this story, starting chapter 27, verse 9. Much time had been lost, and the voyage was now dangerous since the day of reconciliation had already passed. Paul warned them, "I see that our voyage will suffer damage and great loss, not only for the cargo and ship, but also for our lives." But the centurion was persuaded more by the ship's pilot and captain than by Paul's advice. Since the harbor was unsuitable for spending the winter, the majority supported a plan to put out to sea from there. They thought they might reach Phoenix in Crete and spend the winter in its harbor, which faced southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they could carry out their plan. They pulled up anchor and sailed closely along the coast of Crete. Before long, a hurricane-strength wind known as a nor'easter swept along the coast. The ship was caught in the storm and couldn't be turned into the wind. So we gave into it and it carried us along. After sailing under the shelter of an island called Cauda, we were able to control the lifeboat only with difficulty. They brought the lifeboat aboard, then began to wrap the ship with cables to hold it together. Fearing they might run aground on the sandbars, they lowered the anchor and let the ship be carried along. We were so battered by the violent storm that the next day the men began throwing cargo overboard. On the third day they picked up the ship's gear and hurled it into the sea. When neither the sun nor the moon appeared for many days, and the raging storm continued to pound us, all hope of our being safe from this peril faded. For a long time no one had eaten. Paul stood up among them and said, "You should have complied with my instructions not to sail from Crete. Then we would have avoided this damage and loss." So Paul is being taken to Rome at his request. He was arrested, remember, by the authorities, and he demanded to be tried in front of Caesar. And so this battalion, this ship, is taking him to Rome from Jerusalem to stand trial. Now, in Jewish tradition at the time, and in ancient Near East tradition, in Roman belief and in Greek belief, ships only sunk when somebody on board was guilty. So storms like this were a punishment, were in themselves a judgment from God. And they would have also been familiar with the story of Jonah, and remember how Jonah gets on a ship and tries to run away from God, and his ship gets shipwrecked. And it's because he's running away from God. And so this was a very familiar story. And so the men probably didn't believe Paul, didn't listen to Paul because they themselves were innocent. They thought they could outdo the weather. They thought they could outrun the gods. And Paul says, helpfully, after they haven't eaten for 14 days and they haven't had any food and they're throwing all their stuff overboard, "Dude, I told you." "Dude, I told you this was going to happen. I told you back in the port we should have just stayed where we were." Which you could forgive the Roman soldiers for wanting to punch Paul in the face and throw him overboard, right? Because that's not really what they needed to hear at that point. But what it does show, what it does prove, is that Paul is innocent, right? There's no loss of life. God rescues them from the storm. God saves them in every way. They shouldn't have survived this storm, is what Paul is saying. They shouldn't have made it as far as they did. And the only reason they did is because God acted on Paul's behalf and proved his innocence. Now we have to be careful because we have a lot of time and a lot of energy devoted into blaming people. We blame people for their own problems a lot. Well, if they'd just done this, or if they just had acted differently. Or we blame people for not being willing to sacrifice their cargo when they need to and get rid of their baggage, or we try to figure out why they're going through whatever they're going through. And this story reminds us that bad things, storms, come to people who don't deserve it all the time. Storms come to the innocent. And so we can remember that no one is to blame sometimes. Not you, not other people. Sometimes it's just bad. Sometimes it's just a storm. Sometimes it's just the wind. So give yourself a break. And remember that God rescued you from the storm before.